be a spirit kind of inspired question, but earlier when you were talking to Jada, you were asking the group how to deal with the corrupt faith.
Yep.
And Jada was saying you need to feel the corrupt faith.
Yes.
And you had said that there's...
You need to acknowledge it first, he said.
You acknowledge it,
yeah. And then...
And you said there's something more that we have to do. So what is the more that we have to do?
Correct. We have to actually go through the feeling that causes it. Yep, is what we need to do. We have to actually go through the feeling that causes it.
And is that always going to be something from our childhood that we haven't dealt with?
Not always. It could be the anti-something of our childhood. It could be like an example of it. I can give you examples. Let's look at something that it could be from our childhood. Let's say in our childhood, I'm a man, like I'm Jada, so I'm a guy. I've been taught from my childhood by my mother that a woman's role is to give me a prop up all the time, emotionally, to make me feel good about myself all the time. That's what I've been taught. So let's say that's what I've been taught and I liked it. So that's an example of, I'm going to have to work my way through that feeling, right? That I'm not allowed to have that anymore. I'd have to work my way through that feeling. I'd have to work my way through the feeling that I want it, but it's actually not right to want it, right? So that's an example of me wanting something that I was taught in my childhood. But let's say I might have grown up exactly the same as Jad and been taught that, but found it very claustrophobic and restricting in my life as a young person. So I might have decided that I'm going to do the complete opposite of that. In other words, I'm never going to listen to a woman express any opinion about me whatsoever. Right? Now, under those circumstances, a woman starts saying something about me, even if it's something nice, I'll go, it's unimportant, and I'm not listening to it. When maybe I need to. Right? So it depends a bit on how I've responded to the childhood events as to what I choose to do now. And that choice, but the choice is driven by the faith that's corrupt. So what is the faith that's corrupt in the first instance? It's that I need a woman to continually prop me up. That's my corrupt faith, that I need to feel. I need to acknowledge that's what I feel. And I need to go through the feeling that that's how it is. And I need to grieve that I'm going to have to give that up. Right? In the second case, it could be I'm angry about the fact that a woman did prop me up, and I feel like now I'm dependent on the woman to prop me up, and I hate that feeling, but I need to go through that feeling to release it. So it could be, it just depends, doesn't it, on what the corruption is telling me as to what feeling I have to go through.
So then it's like you're saying that we could have demands that are not being met that cause us to feel hopeless.
Yes.
Or we could just be hopeless.
Yes. But either one, you've got some corruption in there. Like even a desire for hopelessness.
Yeah, I guess we haven't really explored what our lack of faith is about. Is a lack of faith always related to hope? We call it hopelessness.
Yes.
So it's because based on what you've been talking about, there's a lack of feeling for the future. There's lack of hope for the future.
Yes.
So is a lack of faith, or a corrupt faith, as you call it, always a hopeless feeling that we will feel?
No.
Could you?
So let's look at how this plays out in terms of your particular question.
Yeah.
So an example of a lack of faith. There's a difference between a lack of faith and a corrupt faith. You could say a lack of faith is being absent of faith. So having no faith in faith in no direction. So in other words, you think what you got now is the best you can have.
Is that like, so this is a big group of people here.
Yeah.
So now some of the women are asking, is that like where we were raised to be housewives and we thought, well, that's
who we are.
That's what life is, and there's no real aspiration for anything different because we just felt like, well, that's what...
That's right. So you could say there's a lack of faith in there being anything different.
Yeah.
There's a lack of faith in who you really are as a person.
And is that then the breaking free of that corrupt faith is more a fear-based process?
Correct.
I see.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some lack of faith, or a lot of lack of faith, is driven by a terrible fear or a terror even that causes you to want to avoid a whole heap of things.
That makes sense.
Then a corrupt faith is often where you believe doing the wrong thing will bring you a good result.
Yeah, so if we bully people all the time, that's how we're going to
So that's an example
good
of
about ourselves.
Yeah, that's an example of a corrupt faith where you're bullying somebody thinking it's going to bring a good result, but it can only bring a worse result, right? And so that's an example of a corrupt faith. So a lack of faith would be, I'm so terrified to have a faith in any direction because it will break the current paradigm of what I believe, and I will offend somebody here, or I'll feel uncomfortable there, and so you end up in a state where you don't want to do anything at all, right? But that's really fear, having faith in your fear, that actually it's safer living in your fear than it is to do the other things. So you have to go through fear in order to get out of that.
Yeah, and then there's other people in the group who almost feel like they've got no energy left. It was so sad. They tried for so many things in their early life, and they always were met with a lack of love or harshness, that they almost feel like, why bother anything anymore? So
that you could say that's a faith that there's nothing good.
It's like a sadness then.
Well, it's an avoidance of your sadness, actually. Can you see?
So does that mean if we know, we don't see?
Well, if you lack faith that there's something good, you can get to avoid a whole heap of sadness about that thing. So an example of that. Let's give you some practice.
Well, we were always trying. There's so many people, but some people were saying we were always trying to do what we thought was good and right, but felt like we always
only to be disappointed,
punished and treated harshly.
Correct. So your faith is that you are going to consistently get punished and treated harshly.
Yes, but isn't that a sadness we must grieve before we move forward?
Well, you could say that this lack of faith is being caused by the avoidance of that sadness.
So if we keep trying for something good, then we will feel sad, or we didn't want it, or what? Why are we sad in this place and those people are afraid in their place? Is it because we didn't feel sad when all the bad things kept happening and now we've chosen to not have faith? Or didn't the sadness, it feels like that took away our faith. It was like everywhere we looked and reached for, there was nothing good to be found.
It's not the sadness that took away your faith, it was your inability to feel it in the circumstance.
So we do have to feel it now.
Yes, yes, and you don't want to, right? So the faith is saying, if I feel sadness, it's just going to be never ending and there's never going to be a good result. Yeah. So you're basically saying, I shouldn't feel sad, I've got to try to not feel sad. But the trouble with not feeling sad is that you don't start not feeling anything at all, and you feel numb.
And the confusion is, it's not that we can just have a faith and start doing things in faith again, the faith that we had when we felt innocent.
Yeah.
We can't just have that state back now, can we? Because something has to change.
Correct.
We try.
You can try
to take actions, but it just...
The lack of faith is going to keep dominating the experience.
That's why, so we have to feel the sadness.
Yes, you have to feel what causes the lack of faith.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And in some cases it can be fear, in other cases it could be sadness, in other cases it could be shame. Or
demands. This is new to us.
Well, demands, that's a faith that if you can demand something that you'll get it. You know?
Yeah.
And that it's good. It's a faith in it being good.
Yes, and then when since coming to the spirit world, less demands got met.
Yes.
And then it feels like, well, what's the point?
That's right.
And that's a kind of faithlessness. Well,
that's inaction. Remember one of the things that we were saying earlier, a sign of a lack of faith is just trying to run away. So when you go, oh, well, what's the point of doing anything? That's sort of, or we should be calling hopelessness. That's really saying, I just don't, what's the point of doing anything, right? What's the point of taking any action? Well, that's to avoid, isn't it, how you really feel when you do take action.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an avoidance. So therefore, it's driven by a faith that says, if I do this listless, hopeless thing, I'll get to avoid some pain.
Or frustrated.
But there's pain in that as well. So
yes, and this is a good thing for us because we're all in the first sphere, but we all had such different lives.
Yeah.
We're all kind of been drawn here today, but we thought we had nothing in common. But now when you talk, it's like we all have a lack of faith in common, which is why
you could say either a lack of faith or a corrupt faith in common.
Yeah, we call it a lack of faith,
Yes.
but it's more correct. You're saying to
Well,
corruption.
if you look at a lack of faith, it's sort of like, I don't want to do anything type of feeling. Or some of you have had a feeling, I want to do that thing, like I want to blame that person, or I want to
This should work.
boss that person around or demand this. That's you wanting to do something that is actually not a good thing to do, which the law is showing you it's not a good thing to do, but you feel like it's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
So that's where a corrupt faith comes in, you see.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider, but it's so fascinating that we're all united in the same problem, even, and it's causing a stagnation for all of us.
Yes.
There's so many of us.
Yeah.
And we thought we had nothing in common.
Yeah.
But all of us have this problem, and we've all been stuck for so long.
Yeah.
So
How long have you been stuck for?
It varies.
Yeah.
200 years for me.
Yeah.
Some people 1,000 years.
Yeah.
But we couldn't see anything in common.
Yeah. That sort of would give you an indicator as to why.
Yeah. Some people 50 years.
Yeah.
But it's a long time to be stuck. Also, when we have an idea, all of us have an idea that
progress is possible.
Yeah.
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 And nothing has been progressing.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
If the key with our own progress is every time we stagnate, it's because of our faith. Every time we stop moving forward and growing, it's because of our faith. There's no other reason. It's only because of our faith.
And is it always, it feels to many of us that we'd almost prefer it to be anything but a problem of faith.
Exactly.
Is it always when there's a problem of faith that it feels like such a difficult emotion to pass through?
Correct. And the reason why it is because it's probably the emotions that we're most afraid of. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's why it's such a millstone.
And it's also why we have a tendency to want to avoid dealing with it. So if you think, if I've got a lot of sadness to feel, and deep down inside of me there's that sadness, and I feel that's the worst thing I can feel, then a lack of faith sort of helps me in a way, not really, but I think it will help me by going, well, there's no point in dealing with that sadness.
Yeah, I can bow out.
I can sort of get away from that sadness by doing these other things, whether it's exercise of corruption or just to avoid. I can get away with not having to feel that level of sadness.
Yeah.
So in the end, the motivation is just to avoid the sadness.
Yes.
Right? And so a lot of times our corruption is driven, it is by having faith that dealing with sadness is impossible, or dealing with shame is impossible, or dealing with, whatever it is that I'm worried about is impossible, whatever I'm afraid of is impossible. And we would like to tell ourselves that it's impossible, so that way we don't have to feel something.
Yeah.
So we have this underlying motivation, which is not very truthful. This is why the 5 tools are needed. You need truth, and you still need to be humble, and you still need to know the truth about a matter. But everything starts with the lack of faith. If we can identify the faith problem, then we can start identifying where our problem is.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you don't deal with the faith problem, then you're sort of at sea and you don't really understand where your problems are, and you can stay in that place for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and lots of us have been trying many different things.
Yep.
And it's
Trying actions.
Yes.
Yes.
And even trying to, we wouldn't have called it this, but now we'd call it this, trying to manufacture a positive faith.
Correct. Yeah.
But not dealing with the
anti.
Yeah.
The anti-faith.
The feelings that feel so heavy in us.
Correct. Yeah. Is it while you have a faith that's corrupted, and you're not going to be able to have a faith that's positive on the same thing. So what we start doing is we start telling ourselves, "I'll try for that positive thing," but internally the feeling is, "What's the point of trying?"
Yeah.
And so after a while, you try to force yourself to try, but after a while, the trying sort of ends up having no result, because in the end it's not driven by a true faith in that thing. Yeah, the corruption still exists. So the understanding your corrupt faith is the thing that frees you from stagnation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that requires you can see it requires a level of self analysis, doesn't it? In the sense of going, oh yeah, I do get angry. So I must be corrupt faith there. Or I do try to avoid, so there must be a corrupt faith there. You know, I do try to minimise, or I do try to shift the blame, or even try to manufacture something that's not real. There must be a corrupt faith there. Yeah. And if I can notice where the corrupt faith is, now I have a chance to actually address it. Yeah. But if I don't notice it, then I can go hundreds of years not noticing, not understanding where it is. Yeah.
It's like the best of news and the worst of news.
At the same time.
Yes.
In the sense, best of news is I can progress and it'd be real.
Yeah.
Worst of news is I've got to deal with that thing that I didn't want to deal with.
It feels like the hardest thing to deal with.
That's right. Yeah. And that's oftentimes the things we think are the hardest to deal with. They also have the biggest. Releasing them has the biggest positive result in our life. So it's very important also to understand that principle, to have faith in that principle. That if something's really, really big and it's stopped me for a long time, then obviously if I get rid of it, it's going to help me progress much more rapidly, you see. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having us and for expressing yourself on earth.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's easy to stay in a state of stagnation because we think our corrupt faith is telling us that it gives us something. You know what I mean? Even if it gives us the avoidance of sadness, or it gives us the avoidance of other feelings that we have. And so we often believe that staying in a state of hopelessness is a good thing, protective, you know? Not the case. Chad?
Is corrupt faith the same thing as like your justifications for bad behaviour?
You could say it drives your justifications and your bad behaviour. So this is why I'm saying every time you justify it, notice yourself doing it, because that is driven by a corrupt faith of some kind. Does that make sense? Every time you minimise, every time you run away, every time you sit down and do nothing, every time, it's driven by a corrupt faith. And the key is to recognise the things you do that is actually driven by a corrupt faith, because then you can start to see what that corrupt faith might be. But if you don't see the things you do, then it's unlikely, and you justify them, it's unlikely you'll see what drives them.